So now the mycelium and unobstructedly can form these spirals. Well, why wouldn't they? They conform to the same laws of physics that govern all sorts of other things that form spirals in nature. And then the mycelium is triggered in the mushroom formation, and these are the first beginnings of hyphal aggregates that lead to primordial. So up into this stage, there's been a hyperaccumulation of nutrients. As the mycelium digests a substrate, it's an exothermic reaction. It's thermogenesis. The substrate heats up. Outgassing of carbon dioxide, inhalation of oxygen. The mycelium chose the route that we did not. We have a more common ancestry with fungi than we do with any other kingdom. We separated from fungi 650 million years ago. 4 years ago, in the Journal of Eukaryotic Microbiology, a group of 33 scientists co-authored a paper erecting a new super kingdom called Pt.5, joining fungi and Animalia together. Now, this is one way for you students and scientists here to get through peer review. You get 32 other co-authors. Who's going to dispute you, right? Recommendation there. So we chose the path of circulating our nutrients and creating a stomach, basically. Digesting our nutrients from within. The mycelium digests its nutrients externally. And it exhales carbon dioxide, inhales oxygen, and is photosensitive. And the mycelium, as it streams in the states, it becomes polynucleate. And the mycelial tips become hypernucleate. And this is at the beginnings of the mycelium is branching and seeking new habitats, as well as at the point where primordia were beginning to form. And the primordia form, and then very quickly, the mushroom fruit body forms. Now, these are embryonic stages in the life cycle. So if you cut this, then the mushroom will grow up with a big cut, a cleft in it. And so these are called determinate species. Indeterminate species are like reishi mushrooms. You cut them, they heal themselves. They still come out true to form. Shiitake, oyster mushrooms, button mushrooms form this determinate form. So if you cut them, they do become deformed as they enlarge. So powerful are mushrooms, they can burst through asphalt. So here's a shaggy main mushroom. And road crew engineers learned long ago that you have to get down to mineral earth. You cannot have any organic debris beneath the road surface because the mushrooms will break up the road surfaces. So we did a series of experiments. Some of you have heard about this. The Department of Transportation in Bellingham, Washington. I was working with Battelle Laboratories and Susan Thomas and Battelle and other researchers there. And the Department of Ecology recognized or found that the Department of Transportation had a toxic waste yard. Buses and trucks have been leaking oil and diesel into the ground for several decades. But they gave an exemption for experimental methods. There are 4 piles. One pile is a controlled pile. One pile was treated with the bacteria by one group. Another group treated the pile with enzymes. And then Battelle researchers and myself treated the 4th pile with oyster mushroom mycelium. Now, the oyster mushroom mycelium exudes these enzyme droplets, which are digestive enzymes that break down lignin and cellulose that are held together with carbon-hydrogen bonds. Those same bonds hold together hydrocarbons. And so the digestive ability of the mycelium to break down cellulose and lignin also affords us a unique opportunity of breaking down hydrocarbons. 6 weeks later, we came back to the experiment. The control pile is dead, dark, and stinky. The pile that was treated with bacteria, dead, dark, and stinky. With enzymes, dead, dark, and stinky. And the 4th pile, when we tore up the tarp, which in the meanwhile the mycelium had absorbed the oil. The mycelium becomes black. We pull back the tarp, and our pile is covered with hundreds and hundreds of oyster mushrooms. And the color of the soil changed. And these are what we call very happy oyster mushrooms. These are extraordinarily large oyster mushrooms, which is a testimonial to the fact that you can make use of that toxic soil as a food source. So we believe what is occurring because when you analyze the mushrooms, they had no hydrocarbons whatsoever. We believe what the mycelium is doing is breaking down the hydrocarbons and remanufacturing them into fungal carbohydrates. So this was a tremendously exciting. The PAHs went from 20,000 parts per million polyaromatic hydrocarbons, went from 2%, 20,000 parts per million, to less than 200 in 16 weeks. And thus our pile was then approved for freeway landscaping soil. The 3 other piles remained at 20,000 parts per million. This was a huge test proof of concept. But then something else occurs. And this is a lesson to all of us, I think, is to sit back and watch. Watch nature take its, just unfold by itself. The mushrooms sporulated, they attract insects. Insects came in, flies, they laid eggs. Eggs became larvae. The birds then came in after the larvae. They brought in seeds. Also, wind-borne seeds, no doubt, came in. But our pile became an oasis of life. The other three piles remained lifeless, and our pile suddenly was an entire green berm. I don't have the last photograph. But this showed me that the fungi were the first organisms to come to land. These are gateway species. They break down the toxic barriers, thus enabling downstream populations and biodiversity to ensue. So you can take an oyster mushroom kit bought from any company, and they typically produce about 3 flushes of mushrooms, 3 crops of mushrooms. And then they expire in that they don't have enough nutrition to then erect a new mushroom. But you can take the crankcase oil out of your car, you can pour it over a spent oyster mushroom kit, and more mushrooms come up. You know? Who would have thought, right? So now we don't recommend that you eat the mushrooms, even though they don't have any hydrocarbons in them, because of the metal tailings that are associated with the gears grinding. The mushrooms are well known to hyperaccumulate heavy metals. Well, we started looking at other applications. The Exxon Valdez, most of you, this is a huge tragedy in Alaska, I think 1987, something around that period of time. The Cosmo Bastyr and the San Francisco Harbor, and more recently, the BP oil spill in the Gulf. So every time recently that we've had these huge disasters, I literally get hundreds of emails. I apologize to many of you who have sent me emails. I have not been able to respond. I am overwhelmed. Paul, please do something. What can you do? Suddenly I have this shouldered responsibility. It's like, you know, I said it. I made a mistake of making my lecture. How much can help save the world? So I guess I have to feel the responsibility. But then suddenly people want me to do something. So I really take these to heart. And I said, well, what can we do? So I thought, well, you know, since the oyster mushroom mycelium breaks down oil, and since the substrate is 75% moisture, it should float. And so I created mycobooms. These are socks filled with straw that's fully myceliated with oyster mushroom mycelium. And then the enzymes being secreted by the mycelium would start the process of reducing the complex hydrocarbons. There's just not one hydrocarbon, folks. There are congeners of hundreds of different types of hydrocarbons. So it's a very complex mixture. Once you reduce the ring structures to smaller ring structures, then other organisms like bacteria can come into play. I called several mycologists and I said, well, do oyster mushrooms, will they survive in salt water? Every mycologist I called said, of course not. And I said, well, how do you know? And they said, it's obvious. I go, well, I'm an idiot. It's not obvious to me. So I started playing around and found, and had another huge epiphany, that oyster mushrooms are highly tolerant to salt water. And we developed now saltwater fermentation methods that we can generate tons of mycelium just using salt water in tanks, soaked in straw for a week or two, and then inoculating it without any sterilization, without any other preparation process. And then something else happened that was a surprise. The mycelium outcasted and attracted those flies again. Well, the flies then became food for frogs and fish. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because after the BP oil spill, one of the big calamities that occurred is it impaired the food chain. It's collateral damage across the biosphere and limiting food resources for all of the other organisms within the ecosystem. So by regenerating the food chain, I think that also empowers the immune system of these habitats. And so I think these mycobooms have tremendous potential, especially here in Puget Sound. You could then ring oil spills with mycobooms that are fully biodegradable. You don't have to pick them up. It begins the chain reaction, not only of containing the oil physically, but beginning the process of breaking it down. I'd like to see this being practiced on a much larger scale. Then after Chernobyl, and it seems after every catastrophe, we have a new science lesson and process. Not one that we wanted, but one that we inherit. And then after Chernobyl, two things that were really quite phenomenal occurred. In the downwind environment, scientists were very concerned in the Ukraine about local people collecting wild foods, and because of the radioactive fallout. And so in analyzing wild foods, they found one in particular that was extraordinarily interesting, and that is Gomphidius glutinosus. Hyperaccumulates cesium-137 more than 10,000 times the background levels. So from the radioactive fallout, the mycelium absorbs and hyperaccumulates this metal, up-channels it to a mushroom. The mushroom becomes radioactive. But But in doing so, it de-radioactivizes the entire swath of land that the mycelium was existing in, and doing so lowers the toxic thresholds to allow other organisms to thrive. So my father was a nuclear scientist. We had lots of arguments, and his words are haunting me to this day. He says, son, because he was involved in the vitrification of nuclear waste. And he says, well, one problem, son, is you never want to have your nuclear waste storage adjacent to an operating nuclear power plant. Wow. And not a singular nuclear safety manual was there ever the situation where you would have an earthquake